Hi, so we're starting a brand new unit reading Leilani Nishime's Undercover Asian. And so one of the things we want to do for this first particular lecture is just to give you a framework in terms of what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks, but also get you set up for how this particular week is going to play out and what I'd like you to do for the next 7 days. So a couple of key concepts we want to keep in mind. First, we want to think about, again, this is for the entire 4 weeks, these particular key concepts. We want to be able to understand why does multiraciality matter, not just for the larger United States, but really thinking, well, specifically, what does multiraciality mean for Asian Pacific American communities in terms of the presence of multiracial Asians and how that is going to shift really the way people understand and think about Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Americans in the 21st century and beyond. We also have to go back a little bit before that, and this is where we're going to really start out, is really thinking about and understanding the historical context for multiracial identity in the United States. And this is something where we want to pay attention to, especially in the first chapter of Nishime's book, thinking about, well, what are the different conditions that lead into and play into the reality of multiraciality, and understanding it as not just this random occurrence, but something that really does directly come from historical interactions between the United States, European nations, and these different nations in Asia, really from the 16th, 17th century through to the present, although in reality we're really only going to be focusing on the 19th and 20th century for the more immediate context. Third, we want to think about how this then connects to the larger theme of Nishime's book, which is how are Asian Pacific Americans both visible or invisible in American popular culture, and really thinking about popular culture as being something that is rooted in the 20th century and obviously into the 21st century, but very, very specifically tying it to things like motion pictures and television. And then eventually we'll get into things like the internet, but really, for Nishime's book, it's focusing primarily on motion pictures and television and the post-World War II era. And of course, one of the key figures that she looks at in the start of her book, and really when you think about this idea as well, this particular individual, Keanu Reeves, right? And the idea of, well, what is a Keanu is part of that question in terms of Keanu Reeves' ambiguity. Keanu Reeves, of course, the star of the Matrix movies, where he really gets his the height of his stardom. But really, Keanu Reeves has been a star for his entire adult life. His first big break being in the Bill and Ted movies. But the reality for Keanu Reeves is that, for the most part, his particular celebrity, stardom, fame, not only in terms of his own, private life, but also in terms of his, movies, is the fact that he doesn't actually get identified as physically Asian or visibly Asian, right? Aside from the idea of the name Keanu, which again is reflection of his Hawaiian upbringing, no one really identifies him as even being part Asian, right? The idea of his racial ambiguity is actually something that is, in fact, part of the overall ambiguity that makes Keanu Reeves famed and develops his fame. This is something that Nishime argues, right? And of course, when you read about this next week, we'll go into a little bit more depth about how there's all sorts of ambiguities that go along with Keanu Reeves. That mystery is really where people find him fascinating and turn him into a star. And of course, this is on the flip side, another multiracial Asian, Lou Diamond Phillips, who is part Filipino, but doesn't actually get identified as being part Filipino, even in the many roles that he plays. Lou Diamond Phillips, again, gets his start about 30 years ago, playing the Mexican-American rock and roll musician Richie Valens, who grows up in Southern California in the movie La Bamba. And again, he's playing Mexican-American, and for the majority of his career, Lou Diamond Phillips has either played Mexican-American characters, Latino characters, sometimes Native American characters, but never gets to play someone who is Filipino or Asian, or ever gets identified as someone who's Filipino or Asian. And so we can think about that idea of racial ambiguity also then playing along the idea of, well, how is multiraciality never really even including the idea of possibly being multiracial Asian. And this brings us to really the conclusion of Nishime's text, but also going forward to what we'll cover in a separate article I'm going to have you read, which is by Lori Lopez, thinking about YouTube celebrities who are Asian Pacific American. The idea that in the 21st century, what's really starting to come about is that Asian Pacific Americans are not just the people who are watching and consuming these particular forms of popular culture. Right? They're not just the audience members, but they're actually becoming cultural producers. And even someone like Olivia Munn, who goes really from someone who is a cultural consumer, right? She gets her initial stardom being the host of the cable series Attack of the Show, which is really kind of this, popular culture commentary kind of show, to becoming an actress, becoming the star of the X-Men movies. But again, similarly, part of her particular stardom is built into her racial ambiguity and the idea that she doesn't always get identified or connected to being multiracial Asian. And of course, this is something that we can think about as you go and see her in the X-Men movies, right? When she's, in her particular character, how much of that is actually built into and trying to play off the idea that she might actually be multiracial Asian. And again, another way to think about it is someone like Aziz Ansari, who again starts out really as kind of a fan, but then becomes an actor, and then not only becomes an actor, but actually becomes a cultural producer in terms of actually creating his own Netflix show, Master of None, where he is not only the writer, producer, but also director and stars in the entire show. And he's able, as this cultural producer, to begin to broach these particular questions of the presence of Asians in Hollywood. One of his episodes for the season 1 of Master of None is actually even entitled Indians on TV, where he kind of challenges this idea of, well, how do we understand Indians on TV beyond, their appearance as convenience store clerks, as taxi drivers, people with accents, and, terrorists, and sometimes more than one of those check boxes being checked off in those particular roles, right? Do we actually get to see Asians who are just, quote unquote, plain old folk, right, who are not necessarily who are visibly Asian, but the idea of their Asian ethnicity is not the key element of why they're there in the show in the first place. And so this is something that, again, Aziz Ansari is able to question, but also I think it's becoming more increasingly questioned by, actors and producers who are participating in Hollywood, becoming, the creators of this culture rather than just being the audience members. So for this week, there's several tasks you got to do. The first thing you're going to do, and the first thing I'd like you to do, is to go on, post the discussion board, and there's a series of questions that's going to come up after this on the next slide that will walk you through the process for the discussion board. Again, just a way to generate some ideas and generate some thoughts for the upcoming weeks. There's an online video that you'll need to watch. It's called Multiracial Identity, which will start to, again, I think, frame a little bit that first chapter of Nishime's book. You only need to watch the first 40 minutes of it. The full documentary is, I believe, an hour, 15 minutes long, 75 minutes long. So you only need to watch maybe the first half of it. It will cover most of the relevant points. And again, this is something that's linked primarily through our library. So if you're having difficulty watching it online through Beachboard, you can actually just go through the CSULB library site, and there's going to be a link to that where you can just go into and watch it that way. Third, after you've watched the video, come back, watch parts 2 through 4 of the lecture. Make sure you do the reading as well. And there is going to be a quiz this week, and it's going to cover primarily the reading from Nishime's text, as well as elements and ideas that are covered in that multiracial identity online video documentary. So the discussion board questions. So what would I like you to talk about? For the first thing I want you to think about, and again, this is, even before you begin with the reading, even before you begin and watch the videos, really go on there and post and be honest with this and come straightforward. Try to name at least 2 Asian Pacific American actors, at least 1 male, 1 female, and how you know them. So if you have a particular actor or actress that you say, okay, that person's Asian, I know they're Asian, they're on this show, name the movie, and that's the first thing you want to point out. And then think about, well, why do you know those particular actors? Is it because you're a fan of that particular show? You know that particular actor? You've been following their work? You're a big fan of their entire career? I mean, how are you familiar with this? How do you know this information? and try to think about, well, how did you hear about these particular shows? Is this something that, oh, I watched this show and then I realized that there was an Asian American character on it and I started watching it and I recognize it? Or, again, try to explain or try to think about why you know those particular individuals. Now, there are a couple of ground rules, actually several ground rules for this particular discussion, because I want you to be honest about this, and I want you to think about it as more as a conversation and not as a task that you need to do. So again, this is not necessarily something that you have to answer those first two questions, that first question at least. So what I want you to pay attention to first, no international crossover actors. So one thing, so I do it, especially when I do this on the face-to-face class where I have this particular discussion question, people will always shout out people like Jackie Chan, right, Bruce Lee, right, Jung-Kyung Lee, which gets more recent because it's a Korean actor, international actor, Ken Watanabe, who was in The Last Samurai, and he was in the Batman movie, the first Batman movie with Christian Bale, right? So those are all actors who got their start or their fame in Asia and then crossed over into the United States. So in reality, the reason that they're in the United States and they're in Hollywood cinema is because they're already famous. They have some name recognition, and of course it's tapping into an international audience. What I don't want you to do is I don't want you to talk about those particular actors, because that's kind of, right, it throws off this, the entire equation. So don't talk about actors that are international. Okay, so like I said, no Jackie Chan, no Bruce Lee, no Jet Li, people who got started in those martial arts movies in Asia and then come over to the United States, become famous. Don't talk about them. Okay, talk about people who are Asian American, who get their start and their first fame in the United States. So try to keep it limited to those individuals. Second, don't do any research. So what does this mean? Don't go into Google. Don't type in Asian American actors. I know some of you will be tempted to do this. Don't do that, okay? Because that's more work than I want you to do. I want you to be able to discuss how you know them, be familiar with them, and you don't necessarily have to know their full biography in this discussion board posting. I just want you to say, well, I know that person's Asian, and this is what I know about that particular person. Third, don't name any of the people I've already named. So the people on the previous slide, right? So obviously, you can't talk about Keanu Reeves, you can't talk about Lou Diamond Phillips, you can't talk about Olivia Munn, you can't talk about Aziz Ansari. Sorry, I've poisoned the well on those people, so they're off limits in terms of talking about discussion board posting. So this means these are the people that you can't talk about. So what does this mean? Well, I don't know anyone. That's okay. If you don't know the exact name, you just know that there's this guy in that show that I watch, and I can't remember the actor's name because I don't know anything about that actor. I just know he plays this particular character. That's fine, right? And there are a lot of characters like that. There's a lot of actors like that. So that's perfectly acceptable. Do that. You don't have to know their name. As a matter of fact, if you don't know their name, be honest about that. Or maybe you don't know any at all. It's like, I really can't name any. And again, don't just go to that as your, think about it for a while. You think about the shows that you watch. Think, okay, yeah, that guy. And even think about, okay, I think that actress might be multiracial Asian, but I'm not sure. Go ahead and name that person. That's okay, right? This is not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Part of what I want you to be able to discuss in this particular discussion board posting is to think about, well, how much do we know? How familiar are we with, the presence of Asians on television? And if they're not there, why aren't they there? So this is part of that activity I want you to get started with. Okay, so again, don't think too hard about this. Think about what you watch. Even if you don't watch TV, if you don't watch movies, right? That's okay. But if you know them, go ahead and name them. You don't have to put their names down. That's all right. So that's your task. So after you've done that, go ahead and watch the videos, come back, watch the rest of the videos, watch the online video, post the discussion board, come back, watch the end of the the lectures, and then we'll move on from there. All right? I'll talk to you again in a bit.